roads. Page 13. All right. The creation of the Silk Road. Chief among these was the trade in silk. Silk performed a number of important roles in the ancient world, apart from its value to nomadic tribes. Under the Han Dynasty, silk was used alongside coins and grain to pay troops. It was in some ways the most reliable currency. Producing money in sufficient quantities was a problem, as was the fact that not all of China was fully monetized. This presented a particular difficulty when it came to military pay, since theaters of action were often in remote regions where coins were all but useless. Grain, meanwhile, went rotten after a time. As a result, bolts of raw silk were used regularly as currency, either as pay or, as in the case of one Buddhist monastery in Central Asia, as a fine for monks who broke the foundation's rules. Silk became an international currency as well as a luxury product. The Chinese also regulated trade by creating a formal framework for controlling merchants who came from outside territories. A remarkable collection of 35,000 texts from the garrison town of Frankopan, not far from Donghuang, paints a vivid picture of everyday goings on in a town set at the neck of the Gansu corridor. From these texts, written on bamboo and wooden tablets, we learn that visitors passing into China had to stick to designated routes, were issued with written passes, and were regularly counted by officials to ensure that all who entered the country also eventually made their way home. Like a modern hotel guest folio, records were kept for each visitor, noting how much they spent on food, what their place of origin was, their title, and in which direction they were headed. These measures are to be understood not as a form of suspicious surveillance, but rather as a means of being able to note accurately who was entering and leaving China, as well as what they were doing there, and above all, to record the value of the goods that were bought and sold for custom purposes. The sophistication of techniques and their early implementation reveal how the imperial courts at the capital in Chang'an, modern Xi'an, and from the 1st century AD at Luoyang, dealt with a world that seemed to be shrinking before their eyes. We think of globalization as a uniquely modern phenomenon. Yet 2,000 years ago too, it was a fact of life, one that presented opportunities, created problems, and prompted technological advance. As it happened, developments many thousands of miles away served to stimulate demand for luxury items and the ability to pay for them. In Parthia, the descendants of Seleucus were deposed around 247 BC by one Arsaces, a man whose background is obscure. His descendants, known as the Arsacids, consolidated their hold on power and then set about extending it across Asia into Persia, skillfully expropriating history to fuse Greek and Persian ideas into an increasingly coherent and robust new identity. The result was a time of stability and prosperity. But it was what was happening in the Mediterranean that provided the greatest stimulus of all. A small town in an uncompromising location halfway up the west coast of Italy had slowly managed to turn itself from a provincial backwater into a regional power, taking over one coastal city-state after another. Rome came to dominate the Western Mediterranean. By the middle of the 1st century BC, its ambitions were expanding dramatically, and attention was focused firmly on the east. Sorry guys, give me 1 second. Bear with me, if you will. Taking over one coastal city-state after another, Rome came to dominate the Western Mediterranean. By the middle of the 1st century BC, its ambitions were expanding dramatically, and attention was focused firmly on the east. Rome had evolved into an intensely competitive state, one that glorified the military and acclaimed violence and killing. Gladiatorial games were the bedrock of public entertainment, a place where mastery over foreign peoples and over nature was brutally celebrated. Triumphal arches all over the city provided daily reminders of military victories to its bustling population. Militarism, fearlessness, and the love of glory were carefully cultivated as the key characteristics of an ambitious city whose reach was stretching forever further. The backbone of Roman power was the army. Honed and conditioned to demanding standards, soldiers were expected to be able to march more than 20 miles in 5 hours, hauling at least 50 pounds of equipment with them at the same time. Marriage was not only frowned on, but specifically prohibited in order to keep recruits bonded to each other. Corps of highly trained, fit, and intense young men who had been brought up confident in their ability and assured of their destiny were the rock on which Rome was built. The conquest of Gaul, broadly the area of modern France, the Low Countries, and part of Western Germany, in 52 BC brought substantial spoils, enough to cause a correction in the price of gold in the Roman Empire. But there were only so many other places to take on in Europe, and few of them looked promising. What made empires great were a large number of cities producing taxable revenues. What made them culturally spectacular were artisans and craftsmen who developed new ideas when wealthy patrons competed with each other for their services and rewarded them for their skills. It was unlikely that places like Britain would provide lucrative additions to Rome's territories. As slate letters sent home by soldiers stationed in Britain attest, this province was a byword for grim and fruitless isolation. But Rome's transition into an empire had little to do with Europe or establishing control across a continent that was poorly supplied with the kind of resources and cities that were honeypots of consumers and taxpayers. What propelled Rome into a new era was its reorientation toward the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Rome's success and its glory stemmed from its seizure of Egypt in the first instance, and then from setting its anchor in the East in Asia. Ruled for nearly 300 years by descendants of Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's bodyguards, Egypt had built fabulous wealth based on the Nile, whose floodwaters produced prodigious harvests of grain. These were not only sufficient to support the local population, but provided a handsome surplus that enabled Alexandria, at the mouth of the river, to develop into the largest city in the world, according to one contemporary author, who estimated the population in the 1st century BC to number around 300,000. Grain shipments were carefully monitored, with captains having to take control. Grain shipments Grain shipments were carefully monitored, with captains having to take a royal oath each time they filled their barges, at which point they would be issued with a receipt by by a representative of the royal scribe. Only then would grain be released for loading. Rome had long cast a greedy eye over Egypt. It seized its chance when Queen Cleopatra became embroiled in a messy struggle for political mastery after the assassination of Julius Caesar. After faithfully throwing in her lot with Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium in 30 BC, the Egyptian ruler was soon faced with a Roman army led by Octavius, a master of political cunning, bearing down on Alexandria. Following a series of defensive decisions that combined profound negligence with gross incompetence, Cleopatra committed suicide, either as a result of a poisonous snakebite or perhaps by a self-administered toxin. Egypt fell like a ripe fruit. Octavius had left Rome as a general. He returned as its supreme ruler, with a new title shortly to be bestowed by a grateful Senate, Augustus. Rome had become an empire. The capture of Egypt transformed Rome's fortunes. Now that it controlled the vast harvests of the Nile Valley, the price of grain tumbled, providing a major boost to household spending power. Interest rates plummeted, falling from around 12 to 4%. This in turn quickly fueled the familiar boom that accompanies a flood of cheap capital, a surge in property prices. Disposable income increased so sharply that Augustus was able to raise the financial threshold for qualification for membership of the Senate by 40%. By 40%. Was able to raise financial threshold for qualification for membership of the Senate by 40%. As Augustus himself was fond of boasting, he found Rome a city built in brick, but left in marble. This surging wealth was the result of Rome's ruthless expropriation of Egypt's tax revenues and of its enormous resources. Teams of tax inspectors fanned out across Egypt to impose a new poll tax, payable by all men aged between 16 and 60. Exemptions were granted only in a few special cases. For example, to priests who were able to avoid having to pay, but only after their names had been recorded carefully in temple registries. This was part of a system that one scholar had termed ancient apartheid. Its aim was to maximize the flow of money back to Rome. The process of appropriating revenues was repeated elsewhere as the tentacles of Roman economic and military expansion extended further. Not long after the annexation of Egypt, assessors were sent to Judea to conduct a census, once again so as to ensure the taxes could be collected accurately. Assuming the same model was used as had been employed in Egypt, which required all births and deaths to be recorded, as well as the names of all adult males, the arrival in the world of Jesus Christ would have been registered by an official whose interest lay less in who the infant and parents were, and more in what the birth represented by way of additional manpower and a future taxpayer for the empire. Rome's eyes were opened by the world it encountered in the East. Asia had already acquired a reputation for lazy luxury and fine living. It was indescribably wealthy, wrote Cicero, its harvest the stuff of legend. the variety of its produce incredible, and the size of its herds and flocks simply amazing. Its exports were colossal. Such was Asia's wealth that Romans opined that its inhabitants could afford to dedicate themselves to idle pleasure. Little wonder that it was in the East that Roman soldiers came of age, wrote the poet Sallust. This was where Roman soldiers learnt how to make love, to be drunk, to enjoy statues, pictures, and art. This was hardly a good thing, at least as far as Sallust was concerned. Asia may have been voluptuous and indulging, but its pleasures soon softened the warlike spirits of the soldiers. Presented in this way, the East was the antithesis of everything that stern, martial Rome stood for. Augustus himself made a concerted effort to understand what lay beyond the new frontiers in the East. Expeditionary forces were dispatched to the kingdom of Axum in modern Ethiopia and to the Sabian kingdom of Yemen, while the Gulf of Aqaba was being explored even as Roman rule in Egypt was still being cemented. Then, in 1 BC, Augustus ordered a delayed Then, in 1 BC, Augustus ordered a detailed survey to be conducted of both sides of the Persian Gulf to report on trade in this region, and to record how the sea lanes linked with the Red Sea. He also oversaw the investigation of the land routes heading deep into Central Asia through Persia. A text known as the Stathmoi Parthikoi, Parthen Stations, was produced around this time. It recorded distances between key points in the east and carefully set out the most important locations from the Euphrates up to Alexandropolis, modern Kandahar, in Afghanistan in the east. Alright guys, thank you for joining again.